This is my presentation on Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse was born December 31st, 1869, and died November 3rd, 1954, at the age of 84. Henri Matisse was an important artist in the avant-garde world. His art was dominating much of the scene during this time. He and Pablo Picasso were important pillars to this movement and modern art now. While young, Henri Matisse moved several different times in his life with his father and mother, his father being a corn merchant, as well as his mother, but his mother also found a passion as an amateur painter. Though Henri Matisse has such a big interest in art in his later years, he first started with studying law during the time of 1887 to 1891, but then decided to go to Paris to become a painter. He worked under Adolphe William Bouguereau at the Académie Julian in Paris, but he then left in 1892 to enter the studio of Gustave Moreau at the School of Arts in Paris, where he studied until 1897. Between this time, Henri Matisse painted in a very realistic and impressionistic style. No defined necessarily shapes, but his brushstrokes can still be seen. They're very prominent in the lemons and bottle of Dutch gin in 1896. Though this painting has become torn or worn down, I should say, it is a very dark image in my opinion. Seeing it, the only things that really stand out are the lemons and the white cloth. And this image that is above the glass of gin, I'm assuming. Everything else seems to be very muted. Even this book back here, initially I did not see it because there are similar colors that are in this area as well as in this area that I thought was the same, but turns out as I looked closer, it was a book and not just a part of the table or a part of the wall. And it is also seen that even there are some items in the back of the wall, behind the lemons and behind the bottle of gin, that I can't necessarily see, but there are definitive shapes that can be seen aside from the lemons and everything within the foreground. In the early 1900s, during his exploration of painting, not only did he paint still lifes and landscapes, he also had a big interest in the human form, and that included male and female, about how their postures would give off a sense of mood and atmosphere, even in the painting. And in this one, male model of 1900 oil on canvas, it can be seen that this male is slouching with a wide stance, as if he's tired, and the background seems to be very muted. Having experience of drawing nude models and seeing how dynamic their postures can be, is very interesting to see that he told this model to take a posture that seemed to squish the form instead of accentuate such a large figure as a male's broad shoulders and tall physique. As said before, this is another study of the human figure, this one being a female, but as you can see, this one is not as defined as the oil painting. This being pencil on paper, you can see that this is a quick sketch with simple shapes, and very quick darting lines to get the figure and the posture down. But as you can see, as the lines around the thighs and the torso just below the navel, there are there are dashing lines of cross hatching and hatches that give off the shading of her figure. But as you go up past the shoulders, it can be seen that her face is not as defined and that there are simple lines and a circular shape just to capture the head itself, and as well as the arms, that this shows a very simplistic way of getting down a figure, which in my opinion, I believe this is definitely a gateway into his later work, as you will see in this presentation. Dance is a oil on canvas painting done in the early 1900s, so 1909, but it is not the only one. Matisse painted this for, I believe, a Russian diplomat that wanted something to be a centerpiece to his home, and he was commissioned to do this by that diplomat. This painting shows a very simple background with a lower foreground that the figures are stepping around and they're dancing. All figures look to be women, and they all have their arms stretched out as they're conjoining in a dance as they circle around on the ground. As seen in the earlier paintings, Matisse had very detailed looks, very detailed brushstrokes, and how he captured an image. But as said before, moving forward in his style, he started to create very simplistic shapes, just as this one, the study of Madeleine. He moves forward in this style as he creates the images very simplistically with basic form and basic shapes. Even their faces, the two that are visible, are very simple, and the one that can be seen on the right side of the image has no face, and it's just a simple circular shape. Dance 1 is not, as I said before, was a study for him to create the real thing. And this is Dance 2. As it can be seen, they still have very simple shapes and simple forms, but the motion is much more dynamic. As it can be seen that they look as though they're actually flailing their arms as they're dancing and walking forward. But a closer look and examination shows that he's placed much more detail in some of the imagery, as their feet they've now been given digits such as their toes and the ball of their heel on their foot. There's more curving lines in the back of the very left woman, and the woman to the right of with her head down can be seen with her breast and a very bulging stomach with definitive lines and shading showing her knee and her stomach and her navel, more so than the one that is in this one. During this time, Henri Matisse was not only painting, but he was also a very well-established printer. This is a lithograph of a dancer reflected in the mirror in 1927. Many of his prints were that of studies, but he also was a well-adapted sculptor as well. And as you can see, though he did not leave behind the realistic forms of his figures, you can also see that the simplistic form of his sculptures captured much of his study as well. This one, Tiari of 1930, is a bronze cast, and as you can see, it shows very simplistic shapes, giving us such an impression of the female form from her hair to her nose to even her shoulders. Excuse me. Henri Matisse, um, he used many of these simplistic forms to give such vivid imagery of the human form and female figures. Harmony in Yellow initially was one of his oil paintings, but later in life, as Henri began to suffer from a strand of intestinal cancer, it placed him in a wheelchair up until his death. And during this time, since he could not paint the way he wished, he would take old imagery and use a technique of printing called poussoir. Initially, I thought these two were the same image until, having spoken to Professor Appleby, I could see, and having spoken to Professor Appleby about his process. Poussoir was a way for him to easily recreate a lot of the oil paintings that he would do over time. And this process included a metal sheet, or in some cases, very thick sheets of paper, and would have certain shapes cut out, as if I cut out this blue, or if I cut out this simple shape here and first painted the blue and then cut out a smaller shape and did a sheet registry as to overlay the blue, this would create the image. And that he would also cut out the smaller forms, or even if he didn't cut them out, he went back after printing the entire image and would possibly paint these smaller parts onto the image itself. Henri did not only recreate some of his imagery, but created an entire series called the Jazz series. This series was a look into how jazz influenced art and how art would be influenced by jazz and vice versa. Much of this is very simplistic, with a lot of dynamic shapes, or even, I would say, straight shapes, not necessarily straight shapes, but very like forward shapes, such as these lines, these rectangles, these vertical dashes, if that's a way to say it. Sorry. But even now, or even then, during this time, he still kept with these very simplistic forms, as this female form, the circus, to, and I'm assuming that this is a female form and that she's on that she's a trapeze artist, I believe that's what it's called, giving slight impression that this is a bar that she is standing on, and these are the ropes that she might be holding on to, getting ready to fly across the stage, or the arena. And this is a sword swallower, also within the Jazz series. And much of his imagery not only spoke to the avant-garde world, but a lot of his imagery began to create its own movement called Fauve. This movement, Fauve, or Fauve, I should say, is called the wild beast, having made way to giving off daring, spontaneous strokes and bold handling of paint, shapes, and colors. Matisse paved the way for much of the Impressionism, avant